When was the last time you were in complete darkness? Not the darkness of a bedroom with the curtains drawn. There is always light leaking under the door, the glow of a charging cable, the faint ambient wash from the street. Not the darkness of a power outage. There are flashlights, phone screens, candles from a drawer. Complete darkness. The kind where you hold your hand 6 inches from your face and see nothing. Where the walls of the room disappear. Where the only sense that still functions is hearing, and hearing becomes everything. Most modern people have never experienced it. Some never will. In 1300, it happened every night. From the moment the sun dropped below the horizon to the moment it rose again, 4 hours in midsummer, 16 in midwinter, the medieval world went dark. Not dim, dark. And in that darkness, the world that existed during the day became a different place. The rules changed, the risks changed, the sounds changed. This video follows one night inside a 1300s English home, from the moment the light goes to the moment it comes back. And the night is longer than you think. The transition happened fast. There was no twilight infrastructure, no streetlights clicking on, no headlights, no glowing windows making the approach of darkness gradual. In a medieval English village, sunset was a hard line. 1 hour before dark, the light was fading. 30 minutes before dark, the shadows were long and deep. And then the sun was gone, and it was night. The change was total. A street that was navigable at dusk was impassable 10 minutes later. The ruts, the drainage ditches, the animal waste that the feet had learned to avoid by sight became invisible hazards. People did not go outside after dark unless they had to. Going outside after dark in most medieval English towns was not just inconvenient, it was illegal. The word curfew comes from the Norman French couvre-feu, cover fire. The original curfew was not about keeping people indoors. It was about fire. Every evening, at a time signaled by the church bell, all open fires in the town were required to be covered or extinguished. The reason was not comfort and not discipline. The reason was that a medieval town was, structurally, a fire waiting to happen. Thatched roofs, wooden frames, wattle and daub walls, open hearths. A single unattended spark in a single house could, and regularly did, burn down an entire street. The curfew bell was fire prevention. It was the medieval equivalent of a citywide smoke alarm, rung every evening as a reminder that the most dangerous object in every home was the one keeping the family alive. When the bell rang, the fire was covered, banked with ash, reduced to embers, contained, and the house went dark. Not immediately, and not completely if the household could afford light. The most common artificial light source in a medieval English home was the rushlight. A rushlight was a reed, a common rush, dried, peeled to expose the pith, dipped in animal fat. Tallow. It was held in a small iron clip and lit from the fire before it was banked. The flame was small, unsteady, and dim, roughly equivalent to a single birthday candle. The light it cast was yellow-orange and reached perhaps 3 feet in any direction, and it burned for approximately 15 to 20 minutes before guttering out. 20 minutes. That was the window. In those 20 minutes, the family did whatever required sight, checked the animals, banked the fire, arranged the bedding, used the chamber pot. And then the rushlight was gone, and the next one cost another reed and another dip in tallow. And tallow was not free, and most families could not afford to burn through their supply in a single night. 1 rushlight, maybe 2. 20 to 40 minutes of dim, smoky, foul-smelling light. And then 12 to 16 hours of nothing. The smell of the rushlight is worth mentioning because it adds a layer to the experience that the word candle does not convey. Tallow is rendered animal fat, usually beef or mutton. When burned, it produces a thick, greasy smoke with a smell that contemporaries compared to a slaughterhouse. Beeswax candles, the kind that burned clean and smelled pleasant, were luxury items reserved for churches and wealthy households. A beeswax candle cost roughly 10 times what a tallow rushlight cost. For a peasant family, beeswax was not an option. The light they could afford came with a smell that filled the small, unventilated room and lingered in the clothing, the hair, and the bedding. This was the last sensory experience before darkness, a greasy, smoky light that smelled of animal fat, lasting just long enough to prepare for the 12 hours ahead. And then it was gone. The rushlight guttered and died, and the transition was complete. The room that had been dimly visible, shapes of furniture, the glow of hearth embers, the outline of the far wall, disappeared. The embers of the banked fire gave a faint red suggestion of warmth for perhaps another hour, and then even that faded into nothing. If you have ever been in a cave when the guide turns off the lights, that moment of absolute blackness, where the brain searches for any point of reference and finds none, that is the closest modern equivalent. Except the cave visit lasts 30 seconds, and someone turns the lights back on. This lasted all night. The room was dark in a way that requires deliberate imagination to understand, because the modern mind has no reference point. There was no window letting in streetlight. There were no streets with lights. There was no moonlight through glass. There was no glass. The window openings, if the house had them, were shuttered against the cold. The door was closed. And the room, 15 feet by 10, packed earth floor, the family, the animals behind the partition, was sealed in darkness so complete that the sense of space itself disappeared. The ceiling could have been 3 feet away or 30. The wall could have been an arm's length or across a field. The darkness compressed everything into sound and touch, and the sounds were considerable. The first sounds were the animals, the cow shifting its weight behind the partition, the pig grunting, chickens adjusting on their roost. Chickens do not sleep continuously, and their periodic rustling and clucking punctuated the night at irregular intervals. These sounds were familiar. The family's ears filtered them automatically, the way a modern person filters the hum of a refrigerator. The sounds that were not filtered were the other ones: the scratching, the pattering, the faint, rapid movement across the rush floor that was too small to be the dog and too purposeful to be settling straw. The vermin were nocturnal. During the day, the rats and mice that lived in the walls, the thatch, and the floor rushes were cautious. Visible movement attracted the house cat, the dog, or a well-aimed shoe. At night, in the dark, the balance shifted. The rats emerged. They were after the same thing they were always after: food scraps, grain stores, anything edible that had not been sealed in a container they could not breach. Medieval households stored grain in wooden bins, bread in cloth-covered baskets, dried meat hanging from the rafters. The rats reached all of it. A well-maintained medieval home lost between 5 and 10% of its stored food to vermin. A poorly maintained one lost more. And the rats were not quiet about it. In the complete silence of a medieval night, a silence that itself is almost impossible for a modern person to imagine. No traffic, no electrical hum, no neighbor's television, no background noise of any kind. Every movement of every rat was audible. The sound of gnawing, the sound of claws on a wooden bin, the sound of something moving across the rush floor, close, in the dark, in the direction of where the family was sleeping. If you were lying awake during the watching hour, and everyone was, every night, because segmented sleep meant a waking interval of 1 to 2 hours in the middle of the night, the rats were the soundtrack. The fleas and lice were the other nocturnal reality, and in some ways the worse one, because the rats were at least separate from the body. The fleas were not. Medieval bedding, a straw-filled pallet on the floor, covered with a wool blanket, was a flea habitat. The warmth of a sleeping body attracted them. The darkness allowed them to feed undisturbed. A flea bite in the dark was a sensation that the medieval sleeper registered and dismissed thousands of times over a lifetime. The brief sting, the itch, the unconscious scratch, the return to sleep. The lice were different, slower, less painful per bite, but present in the clothing, the hair, the bedding, as a permanent population that was managed but never eliminated. Delousing was a regular activity, a family member or neighbor picking lice from hair and clothing, killing them between fingernails. It was so common that it appears in medieval artwork without comment, the way a modern painting might show someone checking a phone. The lice came back. They always came back. And at night, in the warmth of the bed, in the dark, they fed. The medieval night also carried something that the modern mind has largely forgotten. Fear. Not fear of a specific threat, although specific threats existed, but a generalized, culturally embedded anxiety about darkness itself. The medieval church taught that night was the domain of the devil. Demons, spirits, and malign forces were understood to be more active and more powerful after dark. This was not folklore to the medieval mind, it was doctrine. The prayers said before bed were not ritual, they were protection. The darkness was not neutral, it was hostile territory. And while a modern person lying awake at 3 in the morning might worry about a meeting or a bill, the medieval person lying awake at 3 in the morning was lying in a world where the forces of evil were understood to be physically present, physically active, and physically close. The sounds on the floor might be rats. They might be something else. The darkness did not allow anyone to check, and the inability to check, the total sensory deprivation of complete darkness, was the condition in which every fear grew. The dark did not cause fear. The dark removed every mechanism for managing it. Here's the thing about medieval sleep that modern research has recently confirmed, and that changes how this entire night should be understood. Medieval people did not sleep the way you sleep. They did not go to bed at 10 and wake at 6 in one continuous block. They practiced what historians call segmented sleep, 2 distinct sleep periods separated by a waking interval. First sleep began at dark or shortly after. It lasted roughly 3 to 4 hours. Then the sleeper woke, not from a disturbance, not from illness, but as a natural part of the cycle. The waking period lasted 1 to 2 hours. During this interval, medieval sources describe a range of activities: prayer, quiet conversation with a bedsmate, tending the fire, eating a small meal, sexual activity. Medieval medical texts specifically recommended the watching hour as the optimal time for conception, which tells you how normalized this interval was. Then came second sleep, another 3 to 4 hours, ending at dawn. This pattern is documented across medieval Europe in diaries, medical texts, legal records, and literature. References to first sleep appear so casually that the writers clearly assumed their readers understood the concept. It was not a curiosity. It was universal. Modern sleep research in the 1990s confirmed that when human subjects are placed in environments with no artificial light, 14 hours of darkness per day, mimicking pre-industrial conditions, they naturally revert to segmented sleep within weeks. The implication is remarkable. The 8-hour continuous sleep block that modern society treats as normal is not the human default. It is a product of artificial lighting. Before electricity, before gas lamps, before even affordable candles, the human body slept in two phases because the night was too long for one. The medieval sleeper was not sleeping badly. The medieval sleeper was sleeping the way the human body was designed to sleep, in a world without light. The waking interval, the watching hour, some sources call it, was a recognized part of the night. It had its own rituals, its own activities, its own quiet intimacy. A husband and wife talking in the dark. A prayer spoken into the silence. The checking of the fire, were the embers still contained? Was the ash cover holding? Because if the fire escaped the ash cover during the night, the house was gone. Fire was the great fear of the medieval night, greater than crime, greater than illness, greater than any of the vermin on the floor. Every house in the village was a fire risk. Every fire in every house was an ignition source. And at night, with the family asleep, with the fire banked but not extinguished, the margin between warmth and catastrophe was measured in inches of ash cover and the quality of the clay hearth. A gust of wind through a gap in the shutters, a rat knocking an ember onto the rush floor, a restless sleeper kicking a blanket too close to the hearth. Any of these was sufficient. And once a thatched roof caught fire, once the dry straw overhead reached ignition temperature, the house was gone in minutes. Not figuratively, minutes. Thatch burns fast and hot. The family had time to get out, if they woke. If the smoke woke them before the heat did, and if the door was reachable, and if the darkness did not disorient them. House fires at night killed people not because the fires were unsurvivable, but because the darkness made escape unreliable. The family that went to sleep in a functioning home could wake, if they woke, in a burning structure with no visibility, no exit lighting, and no fire brigade coming. The night watch, a single person or a pair, walking the streets of the village or town, was tasked with watching for fire. The watch carried a lantern and a bell. If fire was spotted, the bell was rung. The village woke. Buckets were fetched. And whether the fire was contained depended on how quickly the alarm was raised and how lucky the wind was. That was the system. One person with a lantern, walking through a town made of wood and straw, watching for the glow that meant someone's life was about to change. The night watch had other duties beyond fire. He was the law after dark. In a town where being outside at night was, by default, suspicious, because honest people were inside, asleep, the watchman was both police and witness. If he encountered someone on the street after curfew, that person was required to explain themselves. Failure to give a satisfactory account could result in arrest and a night in the town lockup. The night was, by legal and cultural convention, a space where ordinary rules were suspended and replaced by a simpler binary. If you were inside, you were assumed to be innocent. If you were outside, you were assumed to be up to something. The few people who had legitimate reason to be out after dark, midwives attending a birth, priests called to a deathbed, travelers arriving late, carried lights and moved quickly. The darkness itself was the boundary. And if that is considered for a moment, the implications are striking. The medieval night was a space where presence alone was evidence, where the absence of light was the absence of legitimacy. The modern world has nothing comparable. We have forgotten what it means to live in a world where darkness is not an inconvenience, but a jurisdiction. The cold was the other constant of the medieval night. Less dramatic than fire, more pervasive, more grinding. Once the fire was banked, the house began to lose heat. The walls, wattle and daub, had minimal insulation. The thatch provided some barrier overhead, but the floor was packed earth, and packed earth in a medieval English winter conducted cold directly into the body of anyone lying on it. The straw pallet helped. The wool blanket helped. The body heat of the family, sleeping close together, helped. The cow behind the partition helped. A cow generates significant warmth, and that warmth was not incidental to the house design. It was the design. But by 3 or 4 in the morning, in January, the cold had penetrated. The extremities were numb. The nose and cheeks stung. The breath was visible, if there had been any light to see it by. The cold of a medieval January night deserves quantification because the numbers make the experience concrete. Average overnight temperatures in central England in January hover around 0 to 2 degrees Celsius, roughly 32 to 36 Fahrenheit. Inside a house with a banked fire, the temperature was higher, perhaps 8 to 10 degrees Celsius in the first hours, dropping to 4 or 5 by dawn. That is the temperature of a modern refrigerator. The family slept in a refrigerator for 16 hours, in wool clothing and a wool blanket on a straw mat on a packed earth floor. The cold did not kill directly. Hypothermia in an enclosed space with some insulation and shared body heat was rare. What the cold did was suppress the immune system, exacerbate respiratory conditions, and make every other vulnerability worse. The chronic cough from smoke inhalation got worse in winter. The untreated infections got worse. The malnutrition from a limited winter diet, stored grain, preserved meat, whatever the autumn harvest had provided, reduced the body's capacity to generate heat. By February, the cumulative toll of cold, smoke, diet, and darkness had brought the household to its lowest point of health in the annual cycle. Not coincidentally, February and March were the peak months for mortality in medieval English parish records. The house did not protect from winter. The house mitigated winter. And the mitigation was partial, uncomfortable, and barely sufficient. The sounds of the village at night filtered through the walls in ways that the daylight noise did not. During the day, the village was alive with activity, voices, animals, tools, carts, a constant wash of sound that individual noises disappeared into. At night, in the silence, individual sounds became distinct and identifiable. A dog barking in the next farmstead, the creak of a neighbor's door, the distant sound of the night watchman's footsteps on the village path, and the faint glow of his lantern passing the shuttered window. An owl. The wind in the thatch, a sound that every medieval household knew intimately, because the wind in the thatch was the sound that preceded either rain or, much worse, the sound of dry thatch catching a stray ember. The family learned to read these sounds the way a modern person reads notifications. Each sound carried information, and in the absence of sight, sound was the only information system the night provided. And then it came. Dawn. The first light entering through the cracks in the shutters, through the gaps in the door, through the smoke hole in the thatch. In winter, dawn arrived around 8 in the morning, meaning the family had been in darkness for approximately 16 hours. 16 hours. If you went to bed at 4 in the afternoon on a December day in 1300s England, and many people did because there was nothing to do in the dark, the sun would not return until 8 the next morning. In summer, it arrived at 4, meaning the darkness had lasted only about 4 hours, and the night had been brief, warm, and almost tolerable. But in either season, the arrival of light was the arrival of everything. Visibility, warmth once the fire was rebuilt, the ability to move, to work, to see the floor, to check the food stores, to assess what the night had cost. The rats retreated to the walls. The fleas became less active. The cold began to lift. And the family, stiff, bitten, cold, tired in the way that segmented sleep and a straw pallet and a room full of animals and vermin produce, got up and started the day. The same day as yesterday. The market, the work, the bread and ale. And then, in 12 hours or 16, the darkness would return, and the night would begin again, and everything that lived in the dark would resume. That was medieval night. 12 to 16 hours of complete darkness, vermin, cold, fire risk, and a sleep pattern that the modern world forgot until scientists accidentally rediscovered it in a laboratory. 10 videos in, and this is the closest we have come to the lived texture of medieval life. Not the events, not the history, not the dates and battles, but the actual sensation of existing in a world without light. The streets, the food, the frontier, the ruins, the house, the doctor, the prison, the market, and now the night. But there is one more. The worst part of medieval England was not the dirt, the food, or the dark. It was what happened when the plague arrived in a village of 200 people, with no doctor, no hospital, and no understanding of what was killing them. And nobody came to help. That's next. And it's the last.